Michael Williams is a Hong Kong University graduate and leading scholar of Chinese-Australian history. He is the author of Returning Home with Glory and Australia's Dictation Test, and has taught at Beijing Foreign Studies University, Peking University, and Western Sydney University. His digital project Chinese-Australian History in 88 Objects was shortlisted for the 2022 Premier's Digital History Prize. His recent book on the robed Chinese walkers and his current project, Scattered Legacy, highlight his continuing contribution to the field. These podcasts are brought to you by ChideStudyPress, publisher of Chinese-Australian History.
Hello and welcome to ChideStudyPress's 21st podcast. This one is called Beyond the White Australia Policy and has an interesting origin. Originally I was contacted by a TV producer who's producing a series on Chinese Australian history, and after to and throwing with them a little bit by email, they sent me a series of questions which I then answered. So it was kind of like an interview, and then I went off and did an interview which was filmed. In the end it was never used, so I won't mention what series it was supposedly originally for. But the actual series of questions was quite interesting, what they chose to focus on, and as was the whole in this interview process. So here I've used how friendly bots to recreate the interview. It's quite an in-depth overview of Chinese Australian history, going through the Amoy, the gold rushes into the later 19th century, through to White Australia policy, and to bring up to fairly modern times. And so I think it's quite an interesting overview if that's what you're looking for. And again, it emphasises, I often do, the alternative perspective, the perspective of from a Chinese view as opposed to the white Australia, the white guilt view, which kind of often eliminates a lot of nuance. So I'll go into that in some detail. As usual, there's a few squirrely pronunciation problems with our bots, but mostly you'll figure out what they're talking about. The only thing you might want to look out for is when they continually say WAP, meaning, of course, White Australia policy. So I hope you enjoy our podcast today. Thank you.
What if much of what we think we know about a really crucial part of Australia's history, the part that shaped our identity, is actually seen through a lens that misses the full picture, like the vibrant, complex, sometimes uncomfortable picture?
Imagine the stories we haven't heard, the agency that's been overlooked.
Exactly. Welcome, deep divers, to The Deep Dive, where we peel back those layers of history to find the narratives that really shaped Australia and maybe, just maybe, reshape how we see ourselves.
It's a worthwhile goal.
Today, we're diving deep, really deep, into the rich and complex history of Chinese people in Australia. We're drawing from this incredible collection of sources you've shared with us.
Yes, a fascinating set of documents and perspectives.
And our mission today, it isn't just to, recap facts. We want to actively re-examine the common stories, challenge some assumptions, and uncover the surprising agency, the amazing organization, and, the truly diverse experiences that often get glossed over in the usual historical accounts.
And that's so vital, isn't it? To remember, history isn't just one single story. If we sort of zoom out, we see that different perspectives aren't just nice additions. They're absolutely crucial for understanding the past properly, especially when we're trying to challenge those dominant narratives. What's really striking in these sources is that they show a story that's far more nuanced, more layered, and frankly more human than the simple narratives that focus only on racism and victimization.
Right, lets us see the bigger picture.
Exactly.
And speaking of nuance and depth, I promise you, our listeners, you can expect some real aha moments today. We're going on a journey, starting with the very first indentured laborers in the late 1840s, then moving through the incredible self-organization of the gold seekers who came next, delving into the complexities of the White Australia policy and its shadow.
A very long shadow.
And bringing it right up to the diverse community we see today. So get ready for some genuinely surprising details, unexpected acts of resistance, and contributions that I think will definitely reshape your understanding of what it means to be Australian.
Looking forward to unpacking it.
Okay, so right from the start, our sources hit us with a really powerful question. We've all heard the familiar stories about Chinese people in Australia, often focusing heavily on the racism, the discrimination, the victimization they faced.
That's certainly the dominant narrative, yes.
But what if we just completely flipped that? What would this history look like if it was told not from the usual perspective, which tends to center the European experience, but from a Chinese perspective, rooted in their own experiences, their own motivations?
That's the crucial starting point, because that kind of perspective immediately puts Chinese agency, their ability to act, to make choices, to shape their own lives, right at the forefront.
Instead of just reacting.
Precisely. Instead of just reacting to what's done to them, you'd see a history driven by their own complex reasons, their cultural practices, their strategies. This narrative would emphasize those really strong links, the foundational ones based on family and dialect, deeply rooted back in the villages of the Pearl River Delta.
Right.
We'd see how those bonds created these incredibly resilient communities, both back home and here in Australia. It would highlight this powerful sense of organization, of motivation that spanned generations, where, for the most part, people actually achieve their goals pretty much on their own terms, navigating challenges with real ingenuity. And here's a key takeaway from the sources. While racism and victimization definitely existed, and sometimes the impact was severe, no question, for most people, most of the time, it played a minor or maybe even incidental role in their day-to-day operational lives. Their focus was often inward community, family, goals, not constantly looking over their shoulder at discrimination.
That point really struck me too. It feels almost counterintuitive, doesn't it? That even when we condemn racism, if we only focus on victimization, we kind of inadvertently keep the narrative centered on white actions and Chinese reactions.
It's a subtle.
How does that actually play out in the historical record? What gets missed?
Well, it's a crucial shift in how we frame things. You're spot on. This reframing challenges what some historians call a tendency towards, well, a whitewashing of Australian history, where certain stories just get minimized or left out.
Yeah.
The common narrative often reduces Chinese people, almost as a shorthand, to just two roles: miners digging for gold and market gardeners growing vegetables.
The stereotypes.
Exactly. But the sources remind us this is a huge oversimplification. It loses so much depth. They were so much more. Think about Chinese opera performers touring the gold fields, then the cities, bringing culture, entertainment.
Wow, I didn't know that.
Yeah. And successful tobacco farmers up north creating new agricultural ventures. We find newspaper proprietors running Chinese language papers, vital communication hubs for their communities, and even novelists writing about their experiences here.
Really? Novelists?
Yes, documenting their lives, their observations. This incredible diversity in jobs, contributions, daily life, it's so often forgotten. And it really diminishes the richness of their impact on Australia as it was evolving.
It really makes you think, doesn't it, how easily history gets shaped by just one viewpoint, and how much richness, how much truth we lose when we don't actively look for those other perspectives. It's a powerful lesson not just for history, but for how we engage with information generally. You, the listener, might think about how easily narratives get shaped and what we miss by not seeking out different voices. That sets the stage perfectly. So let's go back. Let's transport ourselves to the late 1840s. What were the forces in Australia, economic, social, that led to this, well, surprisingly large-scale importation of indentured labor, especially from Fujian on China's southeast coast? You mentioned it has modern parallels, which is striking.
It really does. If you connect it to the bigger picture, the main driver was simple, powerful economics. This huge demand from Australia's growing rural industries, especially the big sheep farmers, for the absolute cheapest labor they could find.
The squatters.
The squatters, exactly. They were expanding these enormous sheep stations. Wool was becoming the big export. They needed hands, lots of them, for shepherding, shearing, building fences, all of it. In many ways, you could say the Fujian indentured workers were the 19th century version of today's backpacker visa holders working harvests, or maybe the indentured workers from the Pacific Islands doing specific agricultural jobs.
A familiar pattern.
A very familiar pattern. The immediate trigger, though, was a big historical shift. The end of convict transportation to New South Wales in 1840, and then stopping more broadly later. This created what was seen as a labor crisis, sending the squatters into a kind of frenzy to find replacement labor that wouldn't mean paying higher wages to free settlers.
The wage issue.
Always the wage issue. Now, indentured labor also came from India and other places, but Amoy, now Xiamen in Fujian province, became the biggest supplier. This happened after it was forced open as a treaty port following the First Opium War. That basically meant foreign powers like Britain could trade there and set up shop, making it a key spot for recruiting labor.
It seems hard to imagine a scheme like that without some underlying assumptions about the people being brought in. Was race a big factor right from the beginning, or did that evolve? And where did these ideas about Chinese workers even come from?
That's a really important question about how racial thinking developed. Look, while race definitely became more prominent as the 19th century went on, it's important to remember that right at the start, it wasn't just about race.
Okay.
Back then, the ruling elite often saw any poor group of people, regardless of background, mainly as valuable for their labor. Just units of production, essentially.
Right.
However, the Australian colonies were deeply plugged into the British and Dutch colonial empires. Merchants and agents in Sydney knew the systems used in India, Singapore, Batavia, Jakarta, now Canton, Hong Kong. They saw plantations and mines in those places increasingly worked by Chinese laborers.
Ah, so they saw a model.
Exactly. So the discussions about bringing Chinese workers often centered on observations that they were seen as hardworking and, just as important, docile. That perception came directly from experiences in places like Singapore, where Chinese labor was already key to the colonial economy. It fed into these early assumptions about their suitability for Australian pastoral work.
That context is crucial. So flipping it around, what motivated so many workers back in Fujian to actually sign these contracts, to come to this utterly unfamiliar and distant country like Australia? It sounds like a huge leap of faith. Or was something else going on?
It was a real mix, often quite harsh. Hope, definitely hope for a better future. But also sheer desperation from poverty, outright lies told by recruiters, and sometimes, sadly, even force.
Force, like kidnapping.
There are documented cases, yes, but more commonly, coercion. You see, Fujian, especially the port of Amoy, had a long history, generations of people going overseas for work, mainly Southeast Asia. So the idea of leaving wasn't totally new,
Okay.
but they likely had very little idea what Australia would actually be like. It was just overseas, maybe like Singapore or Vietnam in their minds. We have these revealing accounts, even confessions, from the labor recruiters, the coolie brokers. They openly talk about tricking people with false promises where they were going, how long the contract was, and crucially, the wages.
Deception was standard practice then.
It seems quite common. Exaggerated tales of wealth, and the use of drugs like opium to disorient people and get them to sign contracts, that crops up in accounts too. It's grim. But despite all these dangers for, as the sources put it, starving, desperate men at the bottom of the social ladder, the offer of guaranteed work, however risky or misleading, was often just too compelling to refuse. It was a chance, maybe the only chance, to escape poverty.
It's often suggested that widespread famine drove this. Is that accurate?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. Some historians have pointed to famine, but the sources suggest there isn't actually strong evidence for widespread famine across the whole region at that specific time. It seems more likely it was a combination of factors, maybe localized hardship, existing migration patterns, the pull of opportunity, however distorted. It wasn't just one simple cause.
So they arrive, often under difficult circumstances, but they weren't just passive, were they? The stereotype of the docile laborer doesn't seem to fit entirely. How did these Amoy shepherds, as they were called, resist exploitation? That reveals a lot about their spirit.
Absolutely. And what's fascinating is how pragmatic their resistance often was. They even adopted a very, Australian method. They went on strike.
Really? Strikes back then?
Yeah. Not necessarily big, organized mass strikes across multiple farms, but individuals or small groups would just walk off the job, refuse to work until they got better treatment, better food, or the wages they were actually owed. Spontaneous defiance.
Wow. What else?
They were also quite prepared to use the legal system. Their contracts, however unfair, were technically legally binding under British law, so they'd take employers to court for non-payment or mistreatment.
They knew their rights.
Some clearly did, or found ways to access that knowledge. The court records give us these amazing glimpses into their struggles and their attempts to assert themselves. Of course, the language barrier was huge. Getting interpreters, legal help that wasn't easy for everyone.
I can imagine.
So frustration also boiled over into violence sometimes. There are recorded cases of assault, even murder. It shows the extreme pressure and brutal conditions some faced.
A desperate measure.
And ultimately, once the gold rushes started in the early 1850s, that offered a whole new escape route. Many just broke their contracts and headed for the gold fields. Better prospects, more freedom. We don't know the exact numbers, but that potential exodus definitely helped put an end to the large-scale importation of Amoy workers. The supply dried up. The system became harder to manage.
That resistance is really powerful. It shows a real assertion of self. What does that willingness to fight back tell us about their aspirations in Australia? Was it just about survival or something more?
It's tricky to talk about grand aspirations in Australia while they were still indentured, usually for 5 years. Their main goal was probably to finish the contract, save money, and go home to Fujian, improving their family situation. That was the plan.
Mm-hmm.
But those acts of resistance, they absolutely show that some, defying those stereotypes of docility, were ready to fight for their rights or dignity as human beings. When pushed too far, they saw themselves as men deserving fair treatment, not just property.
Yeah.
It really reinforces the idea that not all were the hapless victims of kidnappers that some sensationalist stories or racist cartoons portrayed. It speaks to that basic human need for fairness, respect, asserting your rights, even in really tough situations. They weren't just passive labor, they were individuals with agency.
So what was the ultimate fate of these Amoy shepherds? Did they just disappear from the record, or did they leave a lasting mark?
Well, the evidence suggests most did achieve their primary goal. They finished their contracts, saved some money, and returned to Amoy. For them, Australia was a temporary workplace.
A means to an end.
Pretty much. But some did stay on, continuing to work on the stations after their contracts ended. Employers often rated them as good, reliable workers, so they definitely contributed significantly to Australia's growing agricultural industry, especially in what's now southern Queensland.
So they integrated into the rural economy.
Some did. And crucially, a significant number, though it's hard to pin down exact figures, probably underestimated, settled down, and married here. Sometimes with Indigenous women, sometimes European women. Today, you find quite a few families across Australia who know they have an Amoy man ancestor, even if that's all the detail they have.
A hidden legacy.
Possibly quite a large one. Family history research keeps uncovering more of these connections. What they didn't tend to do, though, was go back to Amoy and then send the next generation back to Australia specifically. That pattern seems to have shifted later, largely because Hong Kong became the main gateway for Chinese migration. Amoy's focus shifted more towards Southeast Asia.
Right, the routes changed. Okay, let's move forward into the 1850s. A completely new chapter opens with the gold rushes. This brought a very different wave of Chinese migrants. Who were these gold seekers, and how were they fundamentally different from the Amoy shepherds, not just in numbers, but in how they got here and why?
Yes, this is a major shift. A stark contrast to the Fujian indentured workers recruited by Europeans. These gold seekers were almost all from just a handful of counties around the Pearl River Delta.
Cantonese speakers, mostly?
Commonly called Cantonese, yes, although the region itself was linguistically diverse. Hakka speakers were significant too, for instance. But the key area stretches east from Canton, Guangzhou, around the mouth of the Pearl River, where Hong Kong sits, recently occupied by the British then. Many from this region had already gone to Hong Kong, making it a vital link.
And they came from villages?
Predominantly, yes. Small agricultural villages, 500 to 5,000 people maybe. Rice farming, subtropical climate. Very different background from the indentured shepherds in many ways.
So it wasn't just geography or language that set them apart. It sounds like their whole approach was different.
Absolutely. The huge difference was their self-motivation and self-organization. This wasn't an external labor scheme. Apart from the ships they chartered, Europeans weren't involved in their immediate organization.
They organized it themselves.
Completely. They typically traveled in groups who knew each other, family, cousins, people from the same village. Deep existing bonds. And since they were mostly cash-poor villagers, they financed the trip through these really sophisticated community borrowing systems.
How did that work?
It wasn't just a simple loan, it was often a whole package deal, arranged from start to finish, covering the passage, the supplies they'd need, tools, tents, food, and even specifying which gold field to head to and who their work partners would be until the debt was repaid, often with interest.
Wow, that's incredibly organized.
It was, and crucially, it was seen as a family investment, a collective venture. The individual gold seeker, overwhelmingly male at this stage, knew his earnings weren't just for him. They were to support his whole extended family back home, parents, younger siblings, eventually a wife and children. That obligation was a massive motivator.
That collective aspect is powerful. Now, did these gold seekers think of themselves as Chinese in the way we understand that national identity today, or was it more local?
That's a great question about historical identity, and it's easy to project our modern ideas backwards. The Pearl River Delta, as I said, was incredibly diverse: dialects, languages, local customs. For these villagers, the absolute bedrock of identity was the family, the lineage. Relationships were expressed in familial terms, extending to the whole clan.
Family first.
Family first, then village, Often people with the same surname, same ancestral temple, then maybe the district, people who spoke the same dialect. They might have seen themselves broadly as subjects of the emperor in far-off Beijing. But the modern idea of Chinese as a unified nation-state with a flag and anthem, that would likely have been foreign to them.
Interesting.
Their loyalty was primarily local. Now, ironically, the European view often lumped them all together, sometimes using terms like Tenrenji, men of Tang, and the influence of Chinese merchants in ports sometimes enforced a broader sense of unity from the outside, even if it wasn't their main self-identity.
So they brought this whole cultural framework with them. How did the history and customs of their home villages actively shape their experiences and goals once they arrived in Australia?
Hugely. Their migration wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was informed by this long history of labor migration and remittance sending within their communities going back centuries. They didn't arrive lost and alone.
They had support systems.
Exactly. They relied on sophisticated self-help organizations like the C and SAME groups. Think of these as powerful district associations based on shared dialect and origin. They provided everything financial help for travel, like collective loans, settling disputes, even arranging burials, a complete social safety net far from home. And cultural practices mattered deeply. That tradition of bones return, the spiritual duty to return ancestors' remains to China for proper burial, kept ties to home incredibly strong. The fact that it was mostly men migrating, leaving families behind with the expectation of return, reinforced this. And their whole approach to work was about partnership, group cooperation, reflecting those village values, not just individual gain.
That level of organization spanning continents is remarkable. But how did these men from remote villages even find out about gold discoveries way over in Victoria? It's not like they had instant news.
They were surprisingly well connected to Hong Kong. Even in its early days, Hong Kong was this vital hub for information, trade, migration, news traveled.
Ah, the Hong Kong connection.
Precisely. News of the California Gold Rush, Gum Sand, Gold Mountain, and then the even bigger strikes in Victoria in '51 spread efficiently through these networks. Merchants, shipping agents, returning migrants telling stories. These distant gold fields became almost mythical places of opportunity.
So it wasn't just one letter.
That popular story, one letter arrives and suddenly thousands come. It's a romantic exaggeration. It really doesn't capture the widespread communication and the sophisticated organizational structures already in place that could mobilize so many people so quickly. Word of mouth through existing trade and family networks was far more powerful.
Okay, so this significant influx starts, and we know the reception wasn't always welcoming. How did the Australian colonies try to stop or discourage Chinese migration to the Victorian goldfields? And why? What were the underlying reasons?
Right. Well, European miners, whether Australian-born or recent arrivals from Britain or elsewhere, tended to see the goldfields as theirs. It was part of the British sphere, and in that mindset, Chinese people, like indigenous people, were often seen as foreigners with less right to the gold.
A sense of entitlement.
You can say that.
Ah.
And it played out in a context already marked by fierce competition and sometimes violence on the goldfields, even between different European groups. Remember, Victoria had only just separated from NSW in 1851, right when gold hit. Its government was tiny, completely overwhelmed.
They weren't prepared.
Not at all. They initially panicked and tried to restrict Tasmanians, Vandemonians, thinking they were all convicts. London disallowed that, but they did permit Victoria to target Chinese arrivals soon after. It became a two-pronged effort.
Okay, what were the two prongs?
First, a hefty 10-pound poll tax, payable by every Chinese person arriving in a Victorian port. A lot of money then. Second, a limit on the number of Chinese passengers per ship, usually 1 per 10 tons of the ship's tonnage. This was originally framed as a health measure against overcrowding, but the intent was clearly restriction. Captains had to pay hefty fines for exceeding the limit.
So, significant barriers. How did the Chinese miners, with all their organization, manage to get around these or fight back? Especially that 10-pound tax.
Well, the Victorians made a crucial error. They imposed the tax only at Victorian ports.
Ah, a loophole.
A massive one. It had actually been pointed out during debates, but they underestimated it. So for the Chinese miners, it was relatively simple, though definitely hard work, to sail to a port like Adelaide in South Australia or Sydney, get off there, and then walk overland into the Victorian goldfields, bypassing the tax completely.
The Great Trek.
Exactly. Later, the small port of Robe in South Australia became a favorite starting point because it was a shorter walk. Of course, if you had the money, if your family network could afford it, you could just pay the 10-pound tax directly at a Victorian port, and many did. Speed versus cost.
So they adapted quickly.
Very quickly. Eventually, the Victorians realized their mistake. Maybe 20,000 people had come in overland without paying. So they introduced a residence tax, the miner's right, payable by everyone on the goldfields. But even that faced widespread protests and evasion. People would just move to another field where enforcement was weaker or try to blend in.
You actually did that walk recently, from road to the goldfields, tracing their path. What did you discover?
Walking in their footsteps must have been quite something. It was an incredible experience, yes.
Yeah.
Very successful, yielded lots of insights. Two things really stood out, challenging some common ideas.
Okay.
First, the sheer level of organization involved in those overland journeys. Some accounts paint the rope walk as this desperate death march through virgin territory by bewildered individuals.
Right, that's the image.
But the reality seems quite different. They were following established pastoral tracks, supply routes, even new roads used by thousands of others heading to the gold fields. They were remarkably well prepared. They had supplies, often hired local guides, bought bullock drays to carry gear, had a ready cash sometimes raised by selling goods they'd brought specifically for that purpose on arrival.
So not helpless victims.
Not at all. Resourceful, coordinated groups. Now, it was definitely hard. Brutal weather, long distances, exhaustion, absolutely. But even when disaster struck, like a ship sinking at Robe, leaving people stranded, their networks could organize emergency money and support from Melbourne or the goldfields. It showed incredible resilience and planning.
That's a very different picture. What was the second thing?
The second was the strange legacy of myths the walk left behind in Western Victoria. You hear local stories attributing old wells, wool sheds, even long dry stone walls to the Chinese walkers passing through.
Really?
Yeah, often with quite vivid details. But when you look closely, the dates, the construction techniques, the sheer improbability of transient gold seekers building massive stone walls, the myths often crumble. It shows a desire to connect with that past, I think, even if the facts don't quite fit.
Fascinating. Any real artifacts?
One credible one stood out. A small wooden cask, kept in a local family for generations, apparently given to a property manager by its Chinese owner passing through around 1856. A small, tangible link.
Wow. The story of the Chinese on the gold fields is becoming better known now, thankfully. But beyond the basics, what deeper lessons from that era do you think we still haven't fully absorbed?
For me, the most important lesson, maybe paradoxically, is not to over-exoticize them.
Don't make them seem too different.
Exactly. They came for gold, like thousands of others from everywhere. They worked hard, like others. Some struck it rich, some failed miserably, like others. Their basic motivations were human motivations. Where they did differ was often in that higher level of organization and that intense focus on family and village back home, maybe more so than many other groups. But there were always exceptions, always individuals.
Right.
The crucial point is, once we accept they weren't fundamentally alien, we can better understand the discrimination and prejudice that targeted them as a group. Prejudice based often on superficial differences, economic fear, cultural misunderstanding. And those kinds of prejudices, sadly, are not so absent from our society as we might think today.
A sobering thought.
And the sources also hint that the story didn't just stop with the first gold rush wave. There were later waves, often neglected in the history books, people seeking other opportunities. More stories to uncover there, too.
Let's shift focus slightly to the role of Chinese Australian merchants. Figures like Lu Yamu, Lo Kongming. How did they manage to build these impressive international trading networks, linking Australia with Asia, especially when, as you said, white nationalism was starting to rise and would later try to shut those connections down? It seems contradictory.
It does seem that way looking back, but it's important to frame it correctly. I wouldn't call their networks vast by today's standards, but for the mid-19th century, they were a typical extensive trading network.
Okay.
And critically, when they were building their businesses, there were no specific efforts to limit their trade or networks by colonial governments. It was a relatively open, if sometimes rough, mercantile world. They were simply successful entrepreneurs.
They faced no restrictions then.
Not specific trade restrictions aimed at them at that point. In fact, both Amui and Lo Kongming were involved in colonial banking, a core economic activity. One bank, the Commercial Bank of Australia, even issued notes with Chinese characters on them for use in the community and trade.
No way. That suggests a level of acceptance.
At least within the business and financial world, yes. It might surprise us now. What's truly remarkable is not that such merchants were prominent, but that the white nationalism of the later 20th century has made us forget what was once ordinary. We now see as exceptional what was then considered relatively normal.
History being rewritten or forgotten.
Exactly. Chinese merchants were well connected across Southeast Asia, part of the fabric of British, Dutch, French colonial trade. They thrived within those empires. It was Australia's post-Federation policies that actively worked to dismantle those networks and marginalize their role here.
So how did Australia start defining itself in that late 19th century period, leading to those later restrictions and this exclusionary nationalism? How did that thinking take hold?
Well, if you look at the colonies back then, even by the late 19th century, they were still remarkably divided. It wasn't one big happy family, even among the dominant British-descended groups.
Divisions within.
Oh, yes. English Protestants versus Irish Catholics, Scots Presbyterians, class divisions between the wealthy squatters, the growing middle class, the workers. Prejudice against anyone with convict ancestry was still a thing, too.
So how did white become the unifier?
Amidst various labels people used, British, Christian, white, the term white started to gain prominence. Perhaps precisely because it was so vague, so ill-defined or nebulous, it could create a broad tent, excluding those deemed non-white.
An exclusionary unity.
Pretty much. And while there was certainly existing cultural prejudice, the increasingly organized working class also had real fears about cheap labor. The use of Pacific Islanders, Kanakas on sugar plantations, Japanese contract laborers, this was growing and seen as a threat to wages and union power. So you get this potent, dangerous mix. Working class militancy fused with a racial nationalism. That became the driving force behind the White Australia idea.
Which leads to a really important and probably quite painful question. Did Chinese Australians back then, late 19th, early 20th century, struggle to be seen as Australian, even if they were born here, identified as Australian? How did that play out?
Yes, that struggle was absolutely real, complex, and deeply personal. Not everyone experienced it the same way, of course. But think about this. Even as late as the 1980s, many Australian-born people of Chinese descent would still unconsciously use Australian to mean white or European Australians. That shows how deeply embedded those racial definitions of identity became.
Wow, even in the 80s.
Yeah. It's hard to generalize. Some individuals, maybe through social standing or personality, felt accepted. Others felt constant discrimination, constant exclusion, despite being born here. A lot of the racism was superficial, based on looks. So a lot depended on the lottery of genetics for kids of mixed heritage. How Chinese they looked often determined how they were treated.
That's harsh.
Very. And for many who stayed within those tight-knit families, maintaining cultural ties, trips back to China, arranged marriages, speaking Chinese at home, their identification as Chinese often remained incredibly strong, maybe stronger than their identity as Australian, in a society that frequently rejected them. It makes you think, you the listener, about that tension between external labels and internal family ties, how that shapes belonging, something many communities still navigate today. Absolutely.
Okay, here's a massive connection, a pivotal moment for the nation. Did these racial anxieties, specifically about Chinese migration, actually influence the decision for the Australian colonies to federate in 1901? Or was federation mostly about trade and defense?
Oh, it was absolutely central. By the 1880s, Chinese immigration was picking up. Again, not like the gold rush, but enough for all the colonies to bring back anti-Chinese laws. These weren't side issues.
They were discussed at federation talks.
Front and center. Immigration control. The threat of non-European labor. These were key topics at the intercolonial conferences debating federation. The need for uniform immigration control was seen as paramount. Chinese immigration and the desire for a racially pure white Australia became one of the most powerful emotional and political arguments for uniting as one nation.
Wow.
By the late 19th century, that fear just suddenly amplified into this generalized rejection of pretty much all natives of Africa, Asia, and the Pacific Islands. So yes, it was fundamental to the creation of the Commonwealth.
And the very first piece of policy legislation passed by the new federal parliament, what was it? Was it specifically aimed at excluding Chinese people?
The first significant policy act, yes, was the Immigration Restriction Act of 1901, with its notorious fake dictation test.
The dictation test.
But here's the interesting diplomatic twist. Because Britain was worried about offending its Indian subjects who were British citizens and its important allies, the Japanese, the act itself, mentions no race or nation at all, explicitly.
So how did it work?
Reluctantly, the Australians adopted the dictation test mechanism. Supposedly, entry depended on passing a dictation test in any European language. But the key was the consensus on who was desirable was so strong, it could be left to officials to decide who got the test.
Ah, discretion.
Exactly. An officer could give the test in English. If the person passed, they could then give it in, say, Dutch. Pass that. Try Italian. Until they inevitably failed. It was fake because being chosen for the test meant you were already deemed undesirable. Failure was guaranteed.
Systemical.
Very. And while no group was named, Chinese people were undeniably the major players in the administration of the act for most of its history, though many others, Pacific Islanders, Japanese, even some undesirable Europeans were caught by it too.
How did events back in China, early 20th century, start to change how people of Chinese descent here identified themselves? It sounds like forces both inside and outside Australia were shaping their sense of self.
Yes, profound changes were happening. First, the obvious. The White Australia policy drastically cut the flow of new arrivals, though it never stopped completely. This meant the existing community aged, and the proportion of Australian-born people grew, even as the total number might have shrunk initially.
A demographic shift.
Definitely. Then you see the merchant class, often Christianized by this point, starting to identify more strongly as Chinese in a broader national sense, not just by village or district.
Why was that?
Partly inspired by the 1911 Revolution and the new Republic of China, a sense of pride in a modernizing homeland, but also because their business networks were increasingly crossing those old dialect lines, fostering a more pan-Chinese identity within Australia.
And external threats.
Absolutely crucial. The rising threat from Japan, especially in the 1930s and during World War II, greatly increased people's sense of being Chinese in a nationalist sense. Facing a common enemy tended to unify the community here against that external threat.
Despite the White Australia policy clearly aiming to restrict them, I get the strong feeling from the sources that Chinese Australians were actually pretty adept at navigating those rules. Is that right? What did that look like?
Yes, that's a very accurate impression. They were remarkably adept, incredibly resilient. And it's a big, but it came at a significant cost.
How so?
Well, the WAP was essentially a big bureaucracy, and surprisingly, it didn't change its basic operations much for its first 50 years or so. Its main goal was keeping new non-Europeans out, but it generally allowed existing residents to stay and travel if they followed all the tedious rules.
So lots of paperwork.
Lots of paperwork. Certificates of domicile, re-entry permits, registration. If you wanted to maintain ties with family back in the village or with places like Hong Kong or Shanghai, you were forced to conform to a tiresome, not an especially oppressive bureaucracy in terms of daily harassment, at least before 1949 when the dedicated immigration department ramped things up.
But they went beyond just following the rules.
Oh, yes. Many went beyond these legal restrictions. Determination found ways. Smuggling became common. People finding ways in without going through official channels.
Yeah.
Bribery of officials, while hard to prove definitively, certainly happened. Using false documents, inventing paper sons to claim family connections for entry. That became widespread.
Wow.
Court challenges against deportation orders substituting one person for another on a permit, all these became common tactics. All part of this ongoing effort to maintain connections, maintain livelihoods, ways of surviving that had existed for generations before the WP came along.
Yeah.
So, adept, yes, but also forced to deal with restrictions, anxieties, legal hurdles no other Australian had to endure. A constant draining battle.
Let's look north now to a fascinating regional difference, the top end. We know the Yolngu Chinese trade up there predates European colonization. Did China's long-standing trade link influence European decisions to settle northern Australia, and were the restrictions on Chinese migrants different in frontier places like Darwin?
Right, the Tripang trade sea cucumber is fascinating. A Chinese delicacy. From at least the 18th century, Makassar traders from Indonesia harvested it along the northern coasts, working with indigenous groups like the Yolngu. Regular seasonal trade. It survived Dutch dominance, survived Darwin's founding.
Were Chinese traders directly involved on the Australian side?
There's no direct evidence of Chinese traders being at the Australian end, harvesting, or being middlemen here.
Yeah.
Though there is one intriguing Dutch record from Timor in 1751 mentioning a Chinese trader visiting the mainland. Just a hint.
Did Europeans see it as a Chinese trade influencing settlement?
I doubt they framed it quite like that. But there was certainly a general strategic anxiety among the British. If we don't settle and develop the top end, someone else, Dutch, China, Japanese, might well take it. And proposals for developing the North often included bringing in large numbers of workers from China or elsewhere, a pragmatic, if racially layered, approach to labor.
And the restrictions, were they different in the NT?
Yes, significantly. The Northern Territory was run by South Australia until 1911, when SA brought in Chinese immigration restrictions in the 1880s, aligning with other colonies. They made a crucial exception. The restrictions applied only to SA proper, not the NT.
Why the exception?
Based on that widespread racist belief that white men couldn't work effectively in the tropics, except as bosses, of course. This created a unique labor situation.
So more Chinese went north.
Exactly. Many arrived, initially contracted for the railway line, then stayed for mining, pearling, business in Darwin. For many years, Darwin's majority population, excluding indigenous people, was actually Chinese.
Really? Majority Chinese?
Yes. And crucially, unlike most other parts of Australia then, a relatively larger number of Chinese women came to the NT in Darwin. This led to more Australian-born Chinese earlier here than most other places, fostering a more settled, multi-generational community sooner.
That's a huge demographic difference. Did this pragmatism in Darwin create a more diverse, maybe less racially divided community than down south?
It's complex. For the Chinese merchant class in Darwin, yes, arguably less discrimination in some ways. Wealth and status always buckered racism to a degree, but for most people, while it wasn't brutal segregation, it resulted in a kind of mild form of apartheid. Communities largely operated separately, owned clubs, businesses, residential areas.
But not total separation.
The interesting exception generally did not include the education system. Despite some initial grumbles from Europeans, all children were generally educated together regardless of race.
Why was that?
Probably budgetary pragmatism in a small frontier town, but it meant the top end was perhaps less racially divided in its core institutions, always accepting the indigenous population, who faced entirely different systemic oppression than it might have been. And the pearl shell industry was another key area of interaction. Chinese, Japanese, Malay, indigenous, European crews, all working, albeit in strict hierarchies.
Given all these policies and pressures, what happened to the overall size of the Chinese-Australian population in the decades after the WAP was introduced? It sounds like it must have declined steadily.
Yes. Overall, there was a steady, gradual decline in the number of China-born residents. People aged, died here, or returned to China. That was the main trend.
But it didn't disappear.
No. The decline was limited, moderated by two key things. First, the growing Australian-born population of Chinese descent. They ensured continuity. Second, and really important, was a kind of loophole or maybe pragmatic adaptation within the WAP. The certificates of exemption.
Certificates of exemption?
Yeah. Temporary entry permits, initially for specific groups like merchants or students, but increasingly they were used for substitutes and assistants. The reality was many Chinese market gardens and businesses simply couldn't survive without extra labor, especially as the original migrants got older.
So the government allowed it?
The bureaucracy, somewhat pragmatically, started recognizing these as Chinese enterprises needing special exemptions. This was partly due to lobbying by the Chinese community, but also an internal bureaucratic acceptance that much of Australia's vegetable production was dependent on Chinese gardeners.
And these permits weren't always temporary?
Exactly. While supposedly temporary, many people managed to get continual extensions, sometimes for years, even decades. Effectively, they stayed permanently in Australia. Clever navigation of the system.
Any other boosts to the population later?
Yes, a couple.
Yeah.
The Japanese invasions in China and Southeast Asia from the late 1930s brought Chinese seamen stuck in Australian ports, and later refugees from places like New Guinea. Many ended up staying after the war.
All right.
And then, as the WP started to slowly unwind in the 1950s and 60s, students started arriving from Hong Kong, Malaysia, other parts of the diaspora under new programs. This led to a small but definite increase, really setting the stage for later changes.
That's incredible resilience, finding ways through such a restrictive system. How did Chinese Australians who stayed respond emotionally, identify-wise? Did they still feel Australian when the nation defined itself as white and often excluded them?
It varied hugely, of course. Up to and during World War II, many seemed to become more outwardly nationalistic, identifying with China, especially against Japan, or remained very focused on family and village ties back home, maintaining identity through those connections.
But after the war?
After the war, and especially after the 1949 Communist Revolution in China, those direct links became much harder, sometimes impossible to maintain. For many in the post-war generation, particularly kids growing up in small towns or rural areas, raised in an assimilationist era, they often simply thought of themselves as Australian.
Assimilation was the goal then?
It was the strong societal pressure. Without the language, without ongoing family contact overseas, there was little alternative as far as identity was concerned. It was a powerful push. Now, it was different for later arrivals from places like Malaysia or Hong Kong, who often kept language and family ties alive.
And the general attitude towards discrimination?
Generally, people knew complaining openly was futile, even counterproductive. Most adopted a heads-down focus on pragmatic business. Work hard, keep quiet, build economic security. William Liu, the prominent merchant who did constantly lobby the government, was really an exception. He acknowledged this widespread, pragmatic, keep-your-head-down attitude was typical for his generation.
Let's bring this right up to date. How did Chinese migration change fundamentally when the White Australia policy was finally dismantled? And how did that reshape the Chinese-Australian community itself?
Well, zooming out again, it's fascinating, like so much in Australian history. It was not solely changes within Australia, but profound changes in China that had the biggest impact on modern Chinese migration.
How so?
As the WIP gradually ended through the 60s and early 70s, the first new waves of Chinese arrivals were still mostly from the diaspora, Hong Kong, Malaysia, Singapore, often professionals, business people. It was only later, when China itself started opening up economically and socially from the late 70s onwards, that you saw larger numbers of students and migrants coming directly from mainland China. That was the big shift.
And that changed the community's makeup.
Massively. Firstly, the sheer increase in numbers was huge, transforming it into one of Australia's largest migrant groups. Secondly, and significantly, the historical dominance of the Pearl River Delta as the origin point was overthrown. People started coming from all areas of China, Shanghai, Beijing, inland provinces, reflecting China's own diversity.
So much more diverse internally now.
Incredibly diverse. And again, while many Australians might just see them as Chinese, these newer arrivals, often Mandarin speakers, bring a variety of dialects and languages that distinguish them from each other, a rich tapestry of regional identities and experiences.
Today, 1.2 million people in Australia claim Chinese heritage. It's an incredibly diverse 21st century community. How does this contemporary community connect with that long 19th century history we've been discussing? Is there a strong link, or is it ancient history for many?
Generally, my observation is that most new arrivals, especially from mainland China, are initially totally ignorant of this early Chinese history in Australia. Their own historical education focuses elsewhere.
But they become aware of it.
Yes, and when they do learn about it through museums, courses, community stories, they are often fascinated and readily identify with it as Chinese. They see a shared ethnic experience, a story of struggle.
But maybe not always accurately?
Well, sometimes that identification involves ignoring the Cantonese element, much to the annoyance of the older Cantonese-descended Chinese Australians, who feel their specific history gets overshadowed by a broader Mandarin-centric narrative.
Interesting tension.
And some newcomers adopt an attitude shaped by how overseas Chinese history is often taught in China itself, with a strong emphasis on racism and victimization. For the Communist Party, that narrative serves a purpose, emphasizing the need for a strong China to protect its people abroad. But for migrants here, it can lead to a ready adoption of the old racism and victimization tropes that also sometimes feature in, say, white Australian discussions of historical guilt.
So a particular lens on the past.
Yes. And while it helps some identify with the past, maybe moralize about the present, it's perhaps not always the most useful for accurately learning about the complexities of the past or truly understanding the nuances of the present. It really shows how history keeps being reinterpreted and why it's important to look at the motivations behind those interpretations.
So reflecting on all this, what does it mean for you, the listener? We've covered 2 centuries, uncovered incredible resilience, organization, diverse contributions, a story so much richer and more complex than the narrow versions often told.
If we connect it all up, it just reinforces this core idea. Chinese people have been a major foundational part of Australia's story for over 170 years, yet they're not always fully seen as an integral part of Australia's identity.
Why is that, do you think?
Largely because, for too long, too much of Australia's identity has been built up of either a slavish link with a British origin or an exclusionary white racism, which actively pushed aside other cultures like the Chinese. We have to remember, national identity is a construct. It often uses history very selectively, not always caring about the nuanced truth. While some try, often with good intentions, to say Australia was always multicultural or highlight specific individuals to make a point, sometimes much damage is done to history in the process. Real understanding means looking beyond the nation-state as the only framework, because that traditional Australian identity was built on exclusion. And reconciling that with a truly diverse history isn't easy. It takes genuine effort.
That's a powerful challenge. The White Australia policy casts this huge, undeniable shadow. But our deep dive today suggests this other story, this secret history, not of hidden underminers, but of active navigation, seized opportunities, cultural richness, and constant, undeniable resistance against an excluding system.
Absolutely. And my vision is that history needs to move beyond this parallelism we often see, where you have the main Australian history narrative over here and then a separate Chinese Australian history over there that sort of touches on it occasionally.
Like a side story.
Exactly. Offering interesting anecdotes, but not changing the main plot. Instead, Chinese Australian history should simply be Australian history, an integrated history.
What would that look like?
It would mean honestly admitting that the nation was, yes, founded partly on racist and oppressive principles, especially towards indigenous peoples and non-European migrants. Admitting it's been a long, slow, often uncomfortable journey towards the relatively tolerant, though still imperfect, society we rather nervously inhabit today.
Which leaves a crucial question for you, our listener, to think about after we finish. How willing are we, really, as a society, to fully weave this complex, sometimes uncomfortable, but vital history, the racism, the resilience, the diversity, into our main national story, instead of keeping it in separate boxes? What would that truly integrated Australian history look like? And what would it mean for who we think we are, our identity, and our future as a nation right now, today? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden currents of Australian history.
Okay, once again, thank you very much to our bots for that interesting interview concerning Chinese Australian history. I think you'll find it was quite an interesting overview, one that brings up many of the questions and themes. The one I'd most like to emphasise is the idea that Chinese Australian history is not a parallel history to Australian history, but in fact is an integral part of Australian history. And still there are need to continue to emphasise this because again and again Australian history seems to want to minimise the role of Chinese Australians. And many historians of Chinese Australia or researchers of Chinese Australia are quite content to simply potter around in their own specialist field and not try to seek integration with the wider Australian context. And I think this is a pity, and certainly I hope that this series of podcasts help to minimise that kind of parallelism between Chinese Australian history and Australian history, and to realise that Chinese Australian history is, of course, simply an aspect of Australian history in the same way as military history is, or political history, economic history, regional histories, and so forth. And so, once again, thank you for listening. And if you want more information, go to the ChideStudyPress email address, gmail.com. You'll see the links there, or look for it under Chinese Australian History at 88 Objects, or ChideStudyPress at CHILDE Study Press, all one word. Thank you again for listening, and have a good day.